Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Thoughts That Move. Thoughts That Move is a platform that invites artists of various mediums to come together and discuss issues of race in their community. I'm your host, Daniel Broxton, and these are our guests. First up, we have Jordyn Marsh. Jordyn Marsh was born and raised in San Antonio, Texas, and has trained in many dance styles. Upon graduating from Earl Warren High School, Jordyn came to Austin to gain her Bachelor in Fine Arts in Dance Education at the University of Texas. Throughout college, Jordyn taught jazz, acrobatics, creative movement, and pre-gymnastics in a few Austin area dance studios. Jordyn had the opportunity to teach at Aikens prior to receiving her degree and also started developing Coretta's Middle School's dance program. Jordyn is currently the head director of the 2020-2021 Aikens High School Dance Department. Next up, we have Toni Neal. Toni has been classically trained in many styles. In 2015, Toni graduated from Las Vegas Academy of Performing Arts, where she majored in dance. After graduation, Toni made the move from Las Vegas to Austin, Texas to receive her bachelor's in dance from the University of Texas at Austin. Throughout college, Toni participated in many performance opportunities with many choreographers. After graduation, Neal decided to go the teaching route before jumping back into performing and is currently teaching at McCormick Middle School in Buda, Texas as the dance director. Up next, we have Kathleen Fletcher. Kathleen Fletcher is a writer, performer, and educator who is returning to the Austin creative scene after 11 years living in New York City. While in New York, she acted in dozens of shows and fronted an electric blues band featured on NPR. She has also toured the country with the show on consent education. For a year, she taught creative writing to kindergarten through 12th grade students, which resulted in some epic stories and poems from brilliant young minds. Currently, she is performing in her original show called Edith Woolman's on her campaign tour. This production is produced by Pollyanna Theater Company and tackles the history of suffrage and civic engagement. Up next, we have Rebeca Gamborino. Rebeca has 25 years of dance training and has worked and choreographed for award-winning companies and studios. Rebeca holds a Bachelor's of Fine Arts in Dance from Texas State University. She recently moved from Austin to Denton with her partner and baby boy to pursue her Master's of Fine Arts at Texas Women's University. Her credits include Competitive Dance Director for Frisco Dance Force, Assistant Company Director for the Dance Zone, Assistant Company Director for Synergy Dance Company in Austin, and Director of the St. Edward's University Dance Team. And finally, Krista Robinson. Krista Robinson is a dancer turned business owner from the Midwest. She hails from Illinois, where she grew up dancing, teaching, and competing into her college years. Before graduating from Northern Illinois University with a focus in English, she also studied and performed with the university dance program, Northern Dance Theater. Krista later moved to Austin, Texas, where she continued to teach, choreograph, and dance professionally for various studios in the area and belonged to several companies. In 2019, she moved back to Illinois to be closer to family as she started her own. Now, she has taken her years of experience in dance and administration to create a business catered to the needs of studio owners, directors, and choreographers. Through this new endeavor, she hopes to continue to satisfy her own need for an artistic existence centered within the exploration of self-care while inspiring others to do the same. Thanks for joining us today. In your opinion, how should schools teach race and culture in the classroom?
As a teacher who teaches in the public education system, I think it's important for one that race is discussed in history curriculum just more frequently than it is currently. When I ask my students in our jazz unit, have they ever heard of blackface? A good 90% of my students have said no. And though that is comforting in some sense, so that it almost signifies that it's not necessarily being done as frequently, it just puts the same students at risk for repeating those same mistakes that have occurred in the past. And it is somewhat at the fault of our history department due to the fact that when it comes to Black history, things tend to be sped through. We will talk about, again, the Holocaust. We will talk about other worldwide issues, but when it comes to slavery, America has not truly taken full accountability of what has happened on the land that the students are learning on currently. I have taken it as a person of color to make sure that that background has been taught through the arts if it is not being taught through history. I make sure that as our students are learning jazz, learning dances that are coming from people of color that have been brought here by force from other activities, that it is known where these dances are coming from and the history of those people, because it is not taught in the same aspect that it should be throughout history curriculum. And I think through dance curriculum, even in general, through both studio and in a public education system.
I personally think that this happens because I've really only been taught by white people. I think the majority of my life, I've only recently been taught by another Latina, but I'm 34. It took this long to actually be taught by someone of my own ethnicity. And so I feel like sometimes what happens is they don't know how to approach it. They're like, and of course now I'm assuming, but from my experience in the classroom, they are hesitant of approaching the subject matter because they don't know what angle to take. It's awkward. It's difficult to talk about these things, especially if it's a class that is diverse, right? Because now you have different backgrounds coming in. And then also difficult if it's a classroom full of white students and now you're telling them, this is your history.
I'm absolutely in agreement. And the thing that there's a couple other pieces I would bring in as we're considering this. The first one is something that's come up before, which is cultural appropriation versus appreciation. The appropriation is where you just take an aspect, and the appreciation is really learning about the history, diving in deeper. It's not just a brief visit. And so I think that really resonates in what you're saying, both of you that have brought up, as far as knowing more of the context of where it's coming from. And for me, as a white educator, it's also a matter of bringing in those different voices. And so I'm talking a lot about history, I've done writing, and it's making sure that it's not all a white voice as far as what's being discussed, as far as what literature comes into the space, who we're elevating. By elevating, I mean, like, I don't mean elevating so much as that, but just which voices you're making the space for more than anything else. For me, being able to introduce some of these complex ideas and have it be in a space where it's like, I want there to be complex ideas, while also letting the students then explore that. And I think as an educator, as a white educator, in my own journey, you know, there's that hesitancy and that fear of like, I really don't want to say the wrong thing. You know, I'm probably going to mess it up and I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. And like that will always exist, I think, a little bit, but knowing that you need to push through that apprehension and force yourself to be uncomfortable, or at least I force myself to be uncomfortable. And of course, in that discomfort is often where there's a lot of growth. And I think it's also good for other white people to model some of that behavior.
I have a lot of conversations with some of my white friends about being white allies and how they can help the movement, how they can do their part and things like that. I can see how there is some hesitation sometimes with not just teaching the right information, but teaching it in a way that's appreciative and not offensive, and how fine of a line that can feel sometimes. But as an individual, for me, thinking about my son's future education or the education that I had growing up, knowing that someone took the effort to teach me something that was outside of their comfort realm means a lot more than them just not teaching it to me at all. Instead of saying or just glossing over slavery entirely, just, hey, this is what we're going to go through. This is the information that I can present to you on the matter. If you know something that I don't know, collectively with the class, let's have a conversation and we can all learn from each other. That holds so much more power than just leaving kids flapping in the breeze.
We are not perfect individuals. We are going to know our own personal experience and exposure. And this is where I feel like a lot of it, again, sometimes comes down to also the collegiate, and this can kind of get traced back down to high school, but what is occurring at the college level? How are fine arts professionals who are going into these public education systems being trained? How are they having these conversations? Because if it's not ever introduced to them, I have, again, colleagues that I feel like when I'm talking about the history of hip hop, it's not going to repeat it unless it's being said by me, because that's not ever a history that has been exposed to them. That's not a conversation that they've had. And so then it's that fear of misrepresenting a group, which I understand completely. Again, I have my own fears about misrepresenting, again, Hispanic and Latina culture that I am not familiar with. I have my fears of making sure, and that's just where, again, ownership also comes through. Just like, hey, I'm trying to introduce you to something maybe different. If you know something that I don't, again, I am not a perfect individual. I just work here. I'm trying to expose you to something else. However, if you know something that could be beneficial for the class, please, again, do not hesitate to add your own personal experience or reflection onto this. And this is where a lot of, again, that student input could be very beneficial, because we have students who are willing to share, willing to talk about their cultures. And sometimes I think it just goes back on the teachers for not allowing them to speak on that behalf. If you don't allow your students the opportunity to speak on their culture, speak on their past, then you'll never get their input in that setting.
Learning and teaching are a two-way street. Like, it's a symbiotic relationship I have with my students, that they're learning from me, but I'm also learning from them. And it's that type of relationship. Unfortunately, in my experience, that is not always the teacher's approach, even at a university level. And I think it goes back to what you're saying, how they feel the pressure that I am the teacher, I must hold the knowledge, and then I must give the knowledge. And then it blocks from a lot of great things that could happen if that mindset wasn't there. When we gloss over things, that has a huge impact, because I'm just gonna be honest, like, in school in Texas, I feel like slavery wasn't really like a huge momentous thing. Like, it was like something that we learned, and I was like, yeah, slavery existed, and now it doesn't. And I walked away thinking that almost my whole life, until pretty recently, until, you know, you expose yourself to other things, like other people, other experiences, podcasts, readings, articles, whatever, you do your self-growth, and then you're like, holy wow, it wasn't just like this moment in time. It was like this whole thing that suppressed and keeps suppressing a population of our country. And I think the magnitude of it is not taught in schools. And because of that, where we're at.
When I came into UT, there was two things that UT dance majors, BFA, had to take, and that was ballet and contemporary. So again, as we started, again, it was very traditional. It was what was it, Toni? Like, we take an hour and 45 minutes. So about almost like 4 to 5 hours of ballet every week. 4 to 5 hours of ballet every week, and then 4 to 5 hours of contemporary. And again, that started off fairly traditional. And again, contemporary is a pretty broad term, so take that as you mean it, obviously. There were times that, again, Broadway jazz, an elective. There were times in which, again, social dance forms were still given kind of like the backstreet. So by no means is the University of Texas some just like perfect institution. There is still some times that clearly, like, it's like, why is ballet being prioritized over, another genre of dance? However, what I can say is that our staff, for one, did have that representation. I grew up only having maybe 1 to 2 Black dance teachers in the 16 years that before I came to UT that were actually resembled me and my cultural background. And so it was appealing, and it was very nice being able to feel like I saw myself in my staff. I saw myself in the content being presented. And what, again, Charles O. Anderson, who became the director over our dance department, really did prioritize were those conversations, because he would hear it within the students, were those kind of like those whispers. And he wouldn't just, and I think that's a lot in the dance world. We hear those whispers of like, ballet is better than, ballet is this, versus, again, these other forms, these social dance forms that come from people of color. And again, that's a whole separate conversation about commercial dance versus concert dance, and what is prioritized in the dance world and what is high art. However, again, he made it a point to make sure that those conversations about breaking down those barriers were just as prioritized, and having those tough conversations with people. If you never have those conversations, then however do you expect to have them at any point in your life? If you can't talk about why this specific form maybe might be uncomfortable for you, then why might that? It's a reflection moment. It really is just a metacognitive moment for you to just reflect and dive in and be like, what about this moment is making me uncomfortable? And realizing both maybe your privilege at the time, where you're coming from, and seeing where people who are not sharing that same privilege are joining you.
There's been so much talk about we learn from one another, but I think again, for me as a white educator, that it's like, I want to create the space, but I don't want to put pressure on anyone to have to speak up for anyone but themselves, and to make sure that it's not like, hey, you're the Black student, tell us about this whole experience. So that's something I'm really cognizant of. But I really also want to bring in, and kids are bringing it right up, and kids are sending me private messages about what's going on that they see, and they're wanting to have a voice. And that's from like everybody in the class, regardless of what race or ethnicity they may be. We're getting a lot of those reactions. And so for me, part of where that's exciting is, in this group, we have a whole range of ages that is represented, and perspectives, right? We're thinking about middle school and high school and college and administrators. And I think kids are up for it. I think the younger we have these conversations, the more comfortable we become with them. And that then really becomes the expectation too. And teaching people how to question, I think, is really important, right? Like, always question where you're getting something, and what is the source, and why is that the perspective that we're being given, and what is maybe missing. And then my favorite question, and I think this is something, as we're talking about like introducing new ideas to our students, how does that make you feel? Is like one of my favorite ones to go to. That's just like, it's really, there's no wrong answer. It's how does it make you feel? And I think for me as a white person, that's also a great entry point to not have it be like, tell me the perspective of everybody. It's just you. How do you feel?
What would be, in your opinion, the line that falls between trauma and education? Because for me growing up, I realized this the other day, I realized how much trauma I feel from school, because one of the things that we focused on all the time, every year from 6th grade, even 5th grade, all the way until my senior year, was how Black people were treated, slavery and racism, over and over and over again. And I got to the point where I realized I started to become two things: afraid to be in class to hear it, and that might have been because of the teachers or the school at the time, or numb to the conversation, like I just didn't care anymore, because I heard the same thing last year. Nothing's new except for maybe the intensity of what's being shown to me.
There is a way to teach it without being triggering to these kids. And especially, I know at middle school level and high school level, anything, and you may not even think of it, could trigger them to feel some kind of way and bring them into a place that they don't need to go back to. So it's a very fine line, but I think that how I've always addressed touchy subjects is to let my kids drive the conversation. And if they're not talking, then just ease more and more until I get a response. And then I drive with that one and just let it keep on driving without just bringing up like a huge, like, yeah, so Black people were abused and brought to this country. And, it hasn't really stopped. Don't push it that hard, even though that's the God honest truth. So yeah, it's a fine line. And I think that's still something that I'll have to think about as an educator.
I think this comes back to, for me, at least a little bit, is this idea too of, what are the voices we're hearing from in the content that we're discussing, right? Where it's like, if your only curriculum on African Americans is about them being enslaved, well, then of course it's that feeling of like, oh, Jesus, this is our history. This is it. Or it's like, no, you've got to bring in more. You've got to bring in different writers. Because I'm sorry, that's like me as the writing teacher. You've got to bring in different histories so that it's not like, by the way, this is the one history you have. And this is something that I confronted a little bit with the show that I've got right now, where I am talking about jazz music. And at first I was like, this has to be super serious because here's how it comes in and this is what it's all about. And then I was like, no, why does it need to be serious? Like, I don't need to come in with this weight to it. What I can have it be is the celebration, and it can, be about the origins of jazz and how it grows, without needing to bring a heaviness of oppression to it. Yes, that is a part of the history, but that's not necessarily the conversation that needs to happen in that moment when I'm talking about like the uplifting sounds.
There's been this video that's been floating around lately where some guy's TikTok where he talks about basically, I'm sick of watching movies about slavery. I don't want to watch any more slavery movies. I don't want to watch anything sad. I don't want to watch Black people being oppressed because I see it every day. And it's if we are if minority communities hold all of this power and we hold all of this potential and we influence so many things, why don't we get those stories on a regular basis? Why can't I get a random rom-com with a bunch of Black people? Why can't I get a horror film with Latinas in it? There isn't enough of, obviously we know that there's a lack of diversity, but there's a lack of diversity within the lack of diversity, if that makes sense. And even though there's a part of me that kind of feels like I appreciate those moments where as much as I hated it in that moment, being the Black kid, the one of maybe two Black kids that everybody's turning to check for their reaction while they're showing gruesome things on the VCR, I needed to feel it because I never would have experienced it, obviously, but I need to feel it because that's how I process the weight of the reality of the situation. But that doesn't need to be the reality of the situation every single time.
So that brings me to the importance of representation. If I don't see possibilities reflected back at me as a Latina, especially as a child growing up, like I don't know that I can be more than, if this is the narrative that I'm constantly getting, then it does seep into my brain and I'm like, oh, well, maybe that is all I am. Or maybe like I can't be, I've never had a professor that's a Latina, so maybe I can't. Or maybe if I am a Latina professor, I have to just teach my heritage. Like I can't do anything else because that's the box that I'm in. So I think that as an educator is showing representation in the classroom. So children and even adults can see the possibilities that are out there and not just the like same stereotypical stories coming at you over and over again.
In terms of an educator, what I would like to see happen more frequently is people being able to reach out to others and ask questions. I can see where other people may feel like if they are not a person of color, where they might get scared to seek out information. And again, obviously I teach and I try to teach a lot about Black history and Black dance forms throughout the year. When I teach hip hop, or I teach jazz, it doesn't have to be just in February during Black History Month. I try to teach that year round. I like almost introduce it. I'm like, hey y'all, yup, guess what we're doing? It's another conversation about race, because I know you're not having this in your history class. It's not just about teaching just Black history for me. I really try to make the effort to be representative of all my students. I have a student, again, we're about to go into our social and folk unit in dance. And I'm coming from my, again, singular perspective. I ask my students, what would be an interest, like coming from your culture, from your background, or even maybe coming from another culture or background? What would be a dance that you're interested in learning more about? I have one Filipino student, I think amongst my entire 200, at least that's what she shared with me. Coming from San Antonio, there was a very strong Filipino population. In Austin, not so frequently. It happens. But she shared a dance. I have one friend that I was raised with at my studio who is Filipino. I just sent her a 3-minute long voice memo. I was like, all right, I got this one student. She asked me about this dance. I'm gonna be honest, I have no idea what this dance is about, but I would love for her to feel like her response and her question is represented. Can you tell me more about this from your perspective, from your family's perspective, seeing that you are Filipino? I want to speak truth to this. I want to be able to represent this as best as possible. So tell me how I can do that for my students, so that the student that asked for this can feel like her culture is being represented. And I think some of us are scared to do that. That isn't always fault to the teacher. I feel like the districts, the university should supply more information for the teachers. Like it shouldn't have to be on me necessarily to always reach out. If I didn't have a friend that happened to be Filipino, I would just be SOL. Like, what would I do with that? Like, I'd be like, sorry, I'm going to have to Google this. I think the district should do more in order to help supply a more culturally responsive curriculum for our students, but simultaneously, I think it is part of the job as a teacher, if you are going to take this role and talk about dance as a whole and talk about dance from across the world, that you should not be afraid to seek out information so that your students can feel represented.
I feel like some people are afraid to ask questions. And why though? Because would you rather turn them away and have them just think something totally different or not know anything at all? Or would you rather educate them and get that information out there and then it reached like 10,000 more kids? Like I just hear that from some people that I even know, like, no, I'm not informing you on stuff that you should already know, but did you have the same access to things like I did, that UT told me, or that my own experience told me? No, and I'd rather share my information, and maybe that's the educator mindset, but I'd rather share the information, even if it is frustrating. Share the information so then other people can know it, and so then we can stop a lot of the ignorance that goes on. Because again, if there is a white dance teacher that's teaching hip hop and they're just teaching their version of it, you're disservicing your students, you're disservicing yourself, and at the end of the day, your school and your program is not going to grow. The questions may not always reach, especially I can only speak for Black bodies because we're tired, but we can't be done yet.
The responsibility as educators should be that it's an ongoing process to educate yourself as well. You know, you're taking on the responsibility of an educator. So with that comes constant reflection and growing and seeing where you can improve and be better. And I think sometimes, in my experience, seeing older educators, they kind of settle in to what's comfortable. And this is how I've done things, and this is how I will continue to do things. And that growth kind of stops. And there isn't that as much of reflection of, okay, what's happening within me that is being projected out into how I'm teaching and what I'm emphasizing or not emphasizing. I personally think that's an important responsibility as an educator, to continue that self-reflection as you're going through the journey.
Should you, as an educator who's also doing self-reflection, hold other educators within your organization or your university accountable for their own self-reflection and how they go about teaching and having conversations of race and culture in their classroom?
I can say, as somebody who has at least a white counterpart, it's kind of awkward. It kind of is awkward feeling like the pressure is on me to have to call people out instead of it being a general district-wide issue. Why do I have to be the person to say, you know, what you're teaching is not culturally responsive? Why is that my job? My job is to teach dance, and I think I'm doing a pretty decent job at that. My job does not include having to call out coworkers. Granted, again, I feel as a person of color, I feel like it's part of my job, but that is like an underlying issue. But I don't feel that it is my job as a dance teacher to have to commit to keeping other teachers accountable. If that was the case, I should be an admin. If it was my job to keep every teacher making sure that what they were teaching was appropriate, that should be an admin's job. And that goes again to a higher level, like, why aren't our admin making sure that what our teachers are teaching are culturally responsive for our students? Why is our district not providing those opportunities for our teachers and for our educators to make sure that these opportunities are being provided for them, for their students? I think it is a bigger issue, and again, it goes higher.
I would say, yes, it is our responsibility to call out our fellow educators. It should not solely be the responsibility of the people of color, because they've been dealing with this in this country since the founding of the country. So again, another personal belief is that systemic racism and white supremacy culture, the ending of it is most definitely a white person problem to fix, right? So the more white voices we have, me included as a white bodied person, the more of us we have co-signing and co-conspiracy with people of color, then things change, right? Because now you have the full support. And unfortunately, again, an opinion, but unfortunately, sometimes things aren't heard until they come from a certain body. You know, things aren't being fully heard until the white people are saying, hey, maybe this is a problem and maybe we should support this and maybe we should change this. And so I've made it a mission of mine that if I see something, I will say something, right? Or if someone else calls it out, then I will align with them, be like, yes, this is a problem, this is an issue. Because a needle doesn't move unless everyone is in unison moving in the same direction. So if you don't call people out, if you don't check them on what they're doing, it's not gonna change. Me included, being like, hey, if I say something or if I do something incorrect, like check me, please, because it's a learning process, right? You learn from your mistakes. You learn from being called out. And if we're too scared, that's a problem, right? I was too scared before. I was hesitant. What will people think of me? What will people say? And if that's what's blocking you from doing it, then none of this will ever change. Not the way it needs to, not a substantial change that needs to happen. And so, yes, 100%, we should be calling our fellow educators out. And I feel like if you're a white-bodied educator, you have more of a responsibility to do that.
If there's no synchronicity with the things that we want our students to learn, how are we teaching them things that require a huge amount of synchronicity? If I'm teaching a 6-step over here in how to be raised, and you go to the class after mine, that 6th step is going to have to look the same as the teacher who gets you after me. If you're in tab class, that time step better be exactly the same from teacher to teacher. So why doesn't that apply to how we interact with each other as human beings, what we know about each other as human beings? Why are we expected to know so many finite details about the art form that we love so much, but not as much as when it applies to us as human beings who interact in the art form, human beings who move and live and breathe through that. It just, that synchronicity has got to be uniform.
I feel like people, and I may be totally wrong, but I've had conversations with my peers, and it's that us as arts teachers are always way more open about having a space specifically for our LGBTQ children. Meanwhile, the core teachers make it very apparent that they do not approve that kind of lifestyle in their classrooms. So I'm wondering why race might be falling behind, or at least racism and how we should be approaching it is falling behind in the arts, but we're so, or at least at my school, again, at my school, we are already there with LGBTQ, and it's very questionable. Do you really want someone who does not accept your child to be teaching your child?
Your question is, should educators be teaching children that they don't accept?
I guess so, because again, like, I'm not going to obviously say any of my coworkers' names, but they will, if a child has made it somewhat apparent that they are not straight, they make it very apparent that they do not approve of their lifestyle and that it may even be wrong, and they avoid the child in the way they choose to live their life. So why is that? And not that obviously you have to agree with their lifestyle, but it's the same thing with the mindset that's been going around with transgender. You don't have to understand it to accept it. So why does that not go for every single educator in public education? You don't have to understand it. You don't even have to like it, but you should accept the student for who they are and keep it pushing.
If you're going to teach children, you need to be able to teach children with mixed abilities, whatever that means, both physically, mentally, emotionally. That is your job. And if you cannot do that, then you should probably find another occupation, because this is what the public education, or you need to pursue like private education. If you are going to have an issue with students of different races, then again, this is not your job, because guess what? There is going to be different races that are going to live in every single city, and you cannot micromanage who does and does not come to your school. I think that also goes back to, again, representation. If the students don't feel supported by the school in itself, then why would they feel supported by individual teachers? And I think that's the big deal, is making sure that, again, students are represented. Again, we might not be able to get, again, people of color that are also queer, but again, you got to take steps where you can. And I know that when I had theater teachers that were queer, it provided a safe space that allowed for students of like mind and like preference to be able to feel like they had a teacher that they can relate to. And I think that is the most important thing, is just being able to find yourself and find that one teacher that you can connect with. And even if it's not about a teacher that you can connect with, at least a teacher that accepts you. And if there's a teacher that cannot accept you, that is an issue as a teacher. You should not be teaching children in mass if you cannot accept them and if their views are different from yours, because at the end of the day, those are not your kids. My goal is not to change them as who they are. I want them to just be more conscious of what they say and how their words and actions define them.
If you cannot be accepting, and if you cannot suspend your judgment as a teacher, you should not be a teacher, because it could have detrimental effects on your students. And that is, for me, that is the main point. That's why you should not be a teacher. And yes to everything Jordyn said. And also in higher education, if you cannot be accepting and suspend your judgment and leave room or give space for other voices, not your own, then get out. You don't need to be doing it.
I want to pose one final question on you guys, which is, what calls to actions would you like to see from your community or your district? And what calls of actions do you plan on taking after this conversation?
One thing that I've tried to be is very vocal about what my desires are with AIC in terms of what I would like to see from dance. I would like to see, again, more opportunities provided for my coworkers who are coming from different backgrounds to learn about race and dance that is outside their norm, or providing opportunities if that is needed. Again, if the teacher just feels completely like, yeah, I'm not going to be able to learn enough about this culture. And again, that's hard to be able to be like, I'm going to teach you all about hip hop in 2 hours for your students. Yeah, that's a lot of pressure. Again, is that realistic? No, that's a time commitment. But if you are not going to provide that opportunity for your teachers, then you need to provide, again, the person to provide that for your students, because at the end of the day, you have these group of students that appeals to. Again, I'm mentioning specifically, obviously, Black dance forms, but this goes for, again, Hispanic, Latin, Asian, different dance forms from around the world. Like, and I have a wide range of students at Aikens that I want to try to appeal for. And I know that based off my personal experience that I don't always have the answers or have that personal experience for. So I at least try to vocalize with the people in the district. I'm like, this is what is not okay. This is what I would like to see. Again, based off of budget concerns or whatever else is happening with regards to COVID now, I might not always be heard, but it's just about trying to make your voice heard in that aspect. At least that is one thing that I have tried to do. I think that is the best thing, at least for my community. And also, of course, just pulling more people that represent and have that opportunity. Like if you can't afford to hire somebody to teach about ballet folklorico, then maybe hire a teacher that has that experience that can continuously to provide those opportunities for fellow dance teachers. Again, we'll never learn if you don't even provide that, because realistically, we don't make enough to seek those opportunities out for ourselves. If I'm being honest, I don't have the money to go take ballet folklorico class and learn that about. When do I have the time? When do I have the money? I don't. So those are things that if the district would like to see that, and the district should like to see that, then the district should provide those opportunities for the teachers.
I'll take this as calls to action for myself as an educator and also as a student at a university, right? So number one, and I said this before, is when I see something, say something. So when I see something in class that doesn't feel right, say something and open up that dialogue Or if another colleague of mine says something, stand with them and be their co-signer. And then as a dance teacher in the studio world and as a guest artist and at a university level, the goal to educate my students of the histories and contexts that I wasn't provided as a dancer growing up, so they could have those resources, but also learning from my students and their experience and their perspectives, their lived experience and their perspectives, because we can learn so much from each other. So putting the teacher ego aside that I know all and inviting them to an open dialogue of what's your perspective? Implementing all these things so that I can be an example to others, right? If someone else sees me doing these things, then perhaps they will be comfortable to picking it up as well. Because especially as a white bodied person, I think we already spoke to this, sometimes we're hesitant that we're going to put our foot in our mouths. And so we don't even try, right? But if someone else has already done it and they have been the sacrificial lamb, then maybe they'll feel more comfortable, like, oh, I'm not going to, like, it's not going to kill me if I get called out, right? It's not going to kill me if I make a mistake and learn from it. I can just learn from it and that be that. And then my last thing is constantly going into self-reflection of why am I doing this? How am I doing this? To really investigate your own biases that we have, because we all have them, right? But if you don't deal with them, then they don't get resolved. So as an educator, that is most definitely, I think, our responsibility to go into those self-reflections, but also just in general, as a human being, you should be doing it. Because that's how we're going to get better, I think. It starts with you. It's so cheesy, right? But it does start with you. Be the change you want to see in the world. Self-reflect, and then be the change you want to be so others can see it and do it too.
Something that I like to sit with when it comes to calls to action is encouraging people to embrace that safety and discomfort are not mutually exclusive. You can be in a safe space and you can be uncomfortable. There's this nice image that I really love to use for people, which has to do with plants and growing, and that plants do their most growing when they haven't been watered recently, when they are uncomfortable. And I just love that imagery of like, yeah, that is when we grow the most. As a white person, that responsibility to call in my peers, to call in other people, where I see it as like, okay, we should talk about this. And like, I understand maybe where you're coming from. Is this right? Well, here's another way of seeing it or another way to approach it. And so that's a call to action I would give to other white people. It's when you see something, you can say something. As a white person to other white people, there is almost a responsibility of like, I have to make sure I don't shut down the conversation though, too. When I'm talking about it, I need to make sure that I don't put someone else immediately on a defense and that they then feel like they can't have this conversation again. There is that like, okay, how are we navigating these conversations while also still being clear of like, that's not cool. And so then I think the last thing I would say for myself as a call to action is to continue to broaden the range of content. What stories am I telling? Whose stories get to come in? I think about my friend who's an English teacher, and I do this as well, where it's like, you can only have like one book that you're reading that's by a white person. Go ahead. You have 12 other books and you will find 12 other books. You need that range. And I think for me, keeping that at the foreground of curriculum that I'm shaping.
I was teaching for a little while last year before the pandemic hit. And in that moment, I had a couple of moments in that year where I was teaching for a private school. It was actually the elementary branch of the high school that I graduated from. And I remember the first week or the first day that we had a group chapel, there were students that I hadn't even met yet that I was going to teach later in the week. And a couple of little Black girls that were probably 3rd or 4th grade came up to me and they were like, "Are you my teacher? Oh my God, I love you so much. Oh my," and they had millions of questions. And even when I'm not teaching, I kind of hold that in a perspective with who I am and what I do. My call to action is no matter where I am in whatever space I am in, I have to hold myself in the same light that little girl saw me in at all. I mean, and that's just something that as a Black woman, my parents have taught me that I have to do regardless because I am a double minority, but I have got to show younger generations that might look at me for a split second that there is something to look forward to, that there is something to aspire to. Even if I don't think that I'm worth aspiring to, somebody else might. And I have to constantly keep that in the back of my head. And outside of teaching, still try to do as much as I can to help support those movements that are trying to further those types of programs that bring art and education to communities that don't always see them. Not education that they think those communities should learn, but education that is inclusive and diverse and applies to those communities that don't get to see it in a different light.
My call to action for my district: create spaces kind of like what we have here right now. Because unfortunately, I think that the arts talk about these things, but core and every other section of school is not. But I feel like this should be kind of like a professional development. What kind of space are you making in your classroom? And even though we're all like about social emotional learning and all of that, but are you creating a space where kids can talk about things that are hard? Are you doing these things? Are you making yourself an open vessel for them to come and talk to? Sure, there's counselors, but we kind of do take that kind of emotional toll from them as well. We are with them more than sometimes most of these kids are with their parents. So they look to us as those supports. But I think just making these kind of spaces, kind of like what we're talking about, but more like a kid version, because we are a bit more outright with it, but these kids can handle some of it. So why not make these spaces in every single classroom? So then we are consistent, just kind of like what Krista was saying, a pot de beret in this class has to be the same in this class. So why not it be the same in dance class as it is in math class? So making it just consistent overall. We're all consistent in the grading handbook. So why not be consistent in how we handle our kids and how we just have basic everyday worldly conversations with our kids.
Thank you guys for joining us. We really appreciate you. Please feel free to reach out if you have anything else you'd like to add for the conversation, or check out our other episodes that are on our channel. That's our episode. Keep doing the work, and thanks guys. Peace.